Okay, guys, well, what I wanted to do was a slightly impossible task, right, which was to talk about digital preservation futures. So I'm setting myself up for a fantastic failure, but you're going to help me. You're going to help me through this discussion. Because really, what we wanted to do as part of today was to invite you all here to investigate some ideas, some thoughts, some places that we're going, some things that you guys might be doing. We're really happy to be heckled. I mean, not me, obviously, other people after me. And also really happy as well to discuss what's going to happen, what we think might happen with keeping all this digital stuff for a really long time. And I'm going to learn from Ben and not say forever, because that's a little bit tricky. So I wanted to give us a little bit of context for this afternoon, because the world changes. It's a bit annoying when it does, like every minute of every day, but it moves on and we have to move with it. And that's quite hard, right? It's really actually quite hard. So what kind of future are we actually trying to do our jobs in? That's probably an interesting point. So some of you may have seen this. I've mercilessly nicked it from the guys on Twitter here who write it every year. And the newest one tells us that every 60 seconds, over 2 million Snapchats are created. 4.8 million GIFs are sent. I had to teach my mum what a GIF was this week. That was painful. That really hurt. Also, well over 18 million text messages. I thought text messages were dead, but 18 million every second, 60 seconds are sent. So this is the volume of communication, the kinds of conversations, and I mean, how many platforms are here? 20, 30? There's probably another 20 or 30 you could all throw at me right now. So the ecosystem of data and information and platforms upon which that is being exchanged is probably impossible to describe. That's what we can safely say. So we also have this weird myth that as time goes on, keeping something gets cheaper. No. Easier? No. But also that our IT budgets, or whichever budget it sits in, gets just exponentially bigger with the demand. That's fine. We're all okay with that. That happens everywhere, right? So we all know this. But the data volumes definitely are getting bigger. But the good news is we don't have to keep everything. And this has been a problem for librarians, curators, archivists, whomever, historians, for the last couple of millennia. This isn't a new problem, we know that. But the volume and the rate, and as I say, the number of platforms, that's newer, that's a bit harder. So we want to make sure that we're not just talking about the cost of storage, which is reducing sort of logarithmically, but it's not really an isolated point. So we want to make sure that, I think in the future, we might be talking more about automation. In the future, we'll probably be talking more about appraisal and how we do that and to what extent that's automated compared to human eyes on a piece. We also want to see how we're selecting this volume of data. How many of your institutions have tried to tackle their official Twitter feed and how we collect that and how people react to that. And then your marketing department says, hey, we want an Instagram account. You're like, oh no, I'm going to have to archive that at some point. But it's all good fun. And then disposition, of course, as well. We can't forget that. Now I'm going to jump on the news. Yeah! So for those of you who haven't seen this from yesterday, this doctor and her team at MIT, over there somewhere, they pictured the first ever black hole. The reason why I put it in here, other than finding a reason to crowbar it in, because I wanted to, the reason I put it in is because you see that stack of hard drives there. Firstly, I'm going, hard drives, but I'm gonna forgive her for a moment. I'm sure she's got an excellent archiving policy tomorrow morning now that she's finished this. But that's 5 petabytes of data, so they tell me. So the news tells me. So how did they get to that? How are they paying for that? What are they going to do with it? How are they indexing it? Who's going to reuse it? Who's going to want it? Where are they going to put it? I'm sure they've got all these questions sorted, but it was interesting when I saw on the Twitter feed that it was put next to Margaret Hamilton, who was also from MIT, who I didn't know, and her first code. which, whilst also equally but differently groundbreaking, was far easier to manage as a collection of data, one would argue. As long as you didn't, get the room wet, you were probably okay. So yeah, I was just very excited. I thought I'm going to put that in. But one of the things that I think is going to happen in the future, and you'll realize this is a theme, a lot of this is probably already happening, this won't be groundbreaking to you, is that when we're talking about analog and digital records, many of you whose remit covers both, or should probably cover digital, but I'll do it tomorrow, then, that's how I felt when I was a librarian anyway, then I think we should, and we will, and some of you already do, have a single data management policy or library policy or archive policy or whatever you use to describe that thing. At the moment, too many organizations have a analog data management policy, and then they have, we were talking at our customer event earlier this week, we were talking about the job title of digital archivist or digital librarian or digital curator even, which insinuates that the other archivist doesn't know or like or care about digital, which is completely untrue. So, but we did come to the conclusion in the room earlier on in our customer sort of side. We did sort of say, well, it is useful to have someone who's a digital expert, who's got some of those perhaps newer skills, because as we know, they change every 5 minutes, but also that can dig into the tools, that can dig into the tech, might even have programming capabilities if that's what you need within your organization, to be able to focus on it and to steward some of those decisions through. So we became at rest with it in the end. But we think we're probably going to need just one data management policy. We know it shouldn't matter what format the thing is in. We also know it does matter, brackets, but it shouldn't. We know that too. So I was thinking, when in your organization will your tipping point be for 100% of your material being managed digitally compared to 100% of your material being created digitally? And there'll be some people working in art museums going, never, I'm fine, thanks. Other people going, it's kind of 50-50, or most of the stuff in my organization is created digitally, but most of the stuff I'm managing is still analog. So if you're in, say, a local council or like a government body, is it in 25 years, do you think? Academic research, 15 years? Pharma, is that happening right now? Museum, that's never going to happen, that's important. The only thing we know is that that's absolute rubbish. We have no idea when that's going to be. But it's an interesting question to try to ask yourself where the tipping point is. How much effort, how much time, how much resource do I and should I put on some of these things? So it's a slightly unfair rhetorical question, but interesting nonetheless. Because this is my point. We have got as archivists and librarians, we have got so many data formats to try and steward as part of our collecting responsibilities. And these are just the first 10 that were off the top of my head. As I say, there's probably about another 10 or 20 immediately behind these. Augmented reality, especially when you're talking about things like museum tours and you've got all these really cool exhibitions and things, and how do you keep that as an experience so that in 35 years' time someone can feel what it felt like back in 2019? What's it going to be like trying to recreate that website of specially digitized objects from 1999? How do we do that even now? Entire software packages, entire websites, online games. There are whole conferences about digital preservation of online games. But I don't actually mean that they're new data formats because I can describe them on a PowerPoint slide. They're not new, they're existing data formats. What they are, potentially for some people in the room, is new areas of archiving. That's actually what we mean. So there will be new things that we have to tackle, which is good because we know that anything that's coming up new in the actively managed, actively used part of your organization is coming to you at some point. And so you can, to a greater or lesser extent, be kind of prepared for that. But you're going to need some software and some places to be able to organize the hugely disparate collection and threads of things. And what you ideally don't want is 10 things to manage 10 things. That's where we're hoping not to get to. You know, and it's that sort of tipping point. You want one place as much as you can. I said I was going to give you a bit of context. So I know many of you know this, but we are talking about preservation, and Ben touched on this as well. Preservation being a whole set of things you do, or that you do with organizations like Arkivum, to help you to mitigate a whole series of risks on your data. Preservation isn't one thing. And as I know that you know, preservation is not digitization. So digitization and digital preservation, two very different things. Very much like when you're talking to your IT departments and you're saying, yeah, backup is not the same as archiving. It's that, you know, we know this. So digitizing something, digitizing an analog record, is one of the really important things that you do as part of your digital preservation program. We know this. And you'll see these little logos come across a couple of the slides that myself and Sinead, when we dig a little bit deeper into the work that we're doing, to help to explain the processes that we think will be important. But from a futures point of view, it's important to get that context. And as I say, these are the sorts of things that we'll be taking you through later on this afternoon. And these are, you know, hugely sort of condensed subjects to sort of cram programs of work into as well, as you can see. Because the problem with keeping data is that when you first get it, it's shiny and new and it works and it's beautiful. And if you just leave it, if you just put it on the road and leave it, I'm going to stretch this car analogy way too far, it will die. It will rust. It will become unusable, unworkable. You haven't put any maintenance or any additional kind of effort into it. It will not stay pristine. Paper is quite well behaved when you think about it in the context of data. Data does not live very long compared to all of these analog records that we've got quite good at keeping for the last couple of millennia. So I think really what's important is when we're starting to introduce the idea of digital preservation, it's quite a lot of things. And it starts to become a little bit over-facing for people to try to address it. It becomes a big monster really quickly. Because if you have this digital data coming to you, it's immediately at risk of corruption, of bit rot, of the file formats no longer being supported. It's a massive one. Or the operating systems or the hardware becoming obsolete. And if you think about the time frames, you think about the cycles, paper, if you keep it fairly dry, fairly cool, it's good for a couple of millennia. This stuff, you know, your operating systems change every 3 years, 2 years, 5 years. Your hardware you have to replace every 7 years if you really stretch it. Your file formats. I did my undergrad dissertation in WordPerfect. Thank you. I cannot read it. I mean, you know, it was groundbreaking. But I'm glad it wasn't, because nobody could read it anymore if it was. I didn't change my file formats over. I've probably got a printout somewhere that nobody can read or access or dig into. So how do we get WordPerfect files and migrate them over time? And this concept of there's no such thing as forever is really interesting, because you're not trying to keep things forever. You're trying to keep things for the next 5 years, and then the next 5 years, and then the next 5 years. And over those series of cycles of managing data, you're trying to do your best to do a couple of things. One, make it as lossless a process as you can, so that the data is as preserved or migrated over as you can possibly make it. So it's not a lossy process that you're applying to converting a Word document to a PDF for access, things like that, as you well know. Also, you need to make sure that it's telling you as much about what you've done with that data for, as Ben mentioned, for all the future archivists, so that they can say, oh, okay, so they've used this tool, they've converted it this way, it's been accessed this many times, the audit trail looks like this, the METs and the premise and all the blah, blah, archivist jargon, it's all in there, it's all good. I'm allowed to say that. But if you're able to do that, then you're doing your very best. That's probably about as far as we can take it at this stage. So when we're talking about back office items, many of you might have seen this concept before. This particular picture is from Andrew Jackson from a few years ago from the British Library. This, I won't expect anybody to try and see any of this, but this is the long tail of data formats in any given fairly large organisation. And so you've got 3.5 billion objects. I mean, this is the British Library, but you can scale the concept down and the concept and the graph retains its sort of credentials. 99.82% of it are in just 20 formats. Excel, Word, PowerPoint, JPEG, MP4, MP3, whatever it is. So there's this idea of sort of parsimony when you're talking about preservation. Deal with the big easy stuff, deal with the stuff that's worrying you, start somewhere. And Elaine will talk a little bit about being sort of, I won't steal your thunder, I promise, about sort of doing something quickly, something good, but good enough, not perfect, because you could still be here in 2, 3, 4 years' time still trying to get things perfect. So the idea of dealing with the majority of the things that you're living with, and then dealing with the long tail of those data formats later, and finding a tool that can deal with as many of those formats as possible. I think in Arkivum there's 900 and something that get addressed automatically, for example. I said also that in the future we would be looking at more automation. And again, as a librarian, I'm thinking, but that's getting rid of all of the intellectual property I have, all of the things I'm applying to these collections. We want to make sure that there's a really excellent balance between automating the easy, the quick, the obvious, and leaving people and our scarce, precious resources to go and do the cool, interesting stuff that computers can't do. So we want to make sure that actually we're doing quite a lot of this already. And again, Sinead will pick up directly on this point about automating workflows, but keeping control. So there's always a bit of a balance on either side. Let's set it up. Let's make sure we're happy. Let's make sure that in my organisation, JPEG to TIFF for preservation purposes is excellent. In my organisation over here, I'm definitely not going to create TIFFs because of this, this, and this reason. Set it up and then automate the workflow. There's a bit of balance to be had there. Being able to automate ingest, actually getting the stuff in there, being able to use a lot of open standards work that gets a lot of that grunt work done, and being able to automate the discovery and the description phase. Quite a lot of work that Sinead will talk about is about being able to automate metadata capture, for example, wherever possible. And being able to go back over those things, because we're not just running in 2019, we're also going to be trying to do the same thing in 2023 and 2033 and onwards. So actually when PDF-A falls off the edge of a cliff, and I think the new version is out now, I think, then we need to be able to have a system that goes, hey, you've got this chunk of your data in this format. There might be something newer, better, different that you need to do, and here are some actions you can take, that sort of thing. And also being able to do hidden preservation. And what I mean by that is lots of your end users, depending on which kind of organisation you're in, don't care at all about preservation. They just want to get the data into the institutional repository or the whatever it is. And underneath that, under the bonnet, see, I told you I'd stretch the car analogy. Under the bonnet, it's just happening. It's going to the right places, it's being encrypted, it's being replicated, it's being preserved, the formats are being moved over time, but the end user doesn't care, nor should they. In the future, what I want, and I had to make up this picture because it doesn't exist yet, I want preservation at the point of creation. I want to be able to create a document in anything and it tell me that the best way to keep this for 20 years is to do X. We're not there yet, which is why we're all in the room, so that's probably a good thing. One of the other things that I think is going to become even more important in the future, more than it is already, is open source technologies. You heard Yaron earlier talking about the fact that Arkivum uses open source as much as we can, and there's a very deliberate reason for that. Because all we do is archiving, we know that the data will have to move, it will have to migrate. Many of you in the room are trying to keep this data for this forever unknown period of time. So it's entirely likely that you're going to need to know how to get data in and out of a system. Because again, what we don't want is anyone sort of suffering from action paralysis to say, well, I'm not going to go and get a system for this, because a system, an IT system, how long do they last? 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years? Probably 25 years. you're trying to keep things for millennia, for decades, for centuries. So you're going to need to be able to migrate this over long periods of time. So one of the things that Arkivum does, for example, is the no vendor lock-in that Jeroen mentioned, and also this sort of data guarantee. So I think this is going to become really important, because then differing levels of expertise within your organizations will be able to kind of lift the lid to a greater or a lesser extent, depending on your level of expertise, the number of people in your team, and your sort of level of wanting to tinker with various systems. So being able to sort of plug in a whole load of open source sort of thinking into a chunk of those workflows makes a lot of sense for us, which is why I'm using the slightly strange porridge analogy. I'm hoping that where we as a company sit in this future, I think, is this sort of perfect porridge, this Goldilocks effect. We're not this big sort of locked up system. We've not this whole bunch of tools that we just leave you to go work it out yourself, and you say, yeah, we need to hire a developer for this. We're in that middle section, and that's really cool for me. I really like that. So I think we'll have more sort of data as a service, less of this DIY work it out for yourselves thing, because that's kind of arresting. That's possibly a problem for people. Unless you're going to tell me you've got 10 data scientists in your organization, then maybe we need a little bit more help, but maintain the control. One of the other key things I think for preservation systems, and we've actually heard about it earlier today from a modular perspective, is the ability to adopt in phases, the ability to move a small step forward rather than a massive jump. Because again, that can be very difficult to actually put into effect. We don't want big bang or sort of all or nothing. We want the ability to be able to do that, say, look, I'm going to sort this out right now. I'm going to have this huge, great big system. I'm going to put it in place, and that's it, done. We want to be able to have this nice, transparent, modular approach to move things forward in sensible phases, whether that's department by department, whether that's format by format, whether that's module or sort of preservation process by preservation process. And so that's how we've built our system, for example. Nice open APIs to link into all these cool tools that people are using and need to get data into. But how do we get access for decades and decades to come for people who are used to being able to Google everything? These are our end users, the sort of the, hey, I'll just quickly search for it, which I'm one of, we all are. You've seen this already, and we want to focus in the next session with Sinead on these few things: compliance, control, consolidation, collaboration, and cost, for obvious reasons. Making sure that we're actually pulling together, more specifically for this room, sort of the consolidation and the collaboration. And what I mean by that is being able to pull together a few different things. So here, for example, context is really important. This could be an art installation, and being able to see it displayed on 12 CRT screens might be the most important thing for this artifact or data sort of source, whatever you want to refer to it as. But from a context point of view, I think in the future it's going to be more important to try and find out what you need it for rather than what it's on. And it kind of comes back to having one data management policy. Okay, it's a VHS tape, but it might need to be seen on CRT screens. It might be part of a criminal investigation in a court, and the quality of the video, of being able to see someone's face or whatever it is, might be the most important thing. So replicating the exact same scenario that this VHS tape gives you might be, compliance-wise, evidential-wise, the most important thing. It might obviously also be a whole load of oral histories, and getting the transcript of this is the most important thing for people to be able to search for what somebody said 5 minutes and 37 seconds into the interview. Or it might be that it's part of a documentary, and getting it off this thing and onto a better media type so that it can be reused for TV and film in the future is the most important thing for this thing. So we all know this, that context is really important. And so again, needing a system that actually allows you to sort of flex that, I think is going to be more and more important as time goes on. And I think finally for me, nearly, the other thing to think about, because I don't know which way it's going to go, is to what extent in the future are we going to come together in sensible groups, whether that's by sector or by geography or whatever, to work together to do this? I don't know. But what we're starting to see in certain parts of the globe and in certain markets is actually how it's splitting at the moment, is those organisations that have very low levels of IT resource, for example, and very low levels of budget, let's be honest, are starting to come together to say, actually, we want to procure a system or to start to work together to pull together some of our resources, some of our money, some of our time, some of our effort, to start to do this collaboratively together. So that's one of those C's I was mentioning. I don't know how I feel about that yet, actually. I think it would probably save those sorts of organisations quite a lot of money, potentially. It could be a more efficient way of getting a system in, especially if you're in this stage of not quite knowing which way to move. It could try and move that action paralysis that I was mentioning earlier. That could easily happen. It does also mean that if you're sort of like a public organisation and you're a consortium of a sensible geographical space and you have one thing that people can go to see your stuff, and I'm being highly technical, as you can tell, then that's actually a better thing for the public if that's part of your mission. And it's definitely better than doing nothing. But I think it is worth mentioning that if you are thinking of coming together as a group to try to make sure that you're doing something with digital preservations and systems, we've seen at Arkivum it could be way less efficient. Because you know in your organisations all the different threads that you're pulling together about workflows and decisions and departments and document types. If you times that by 10, you have to be really rigid in your decision making to make sure that doesn't make the problem 10 times bigger. It works brilliantly well when it works brilliantly well, but you have to be aware of that. The other thing is, as I say, that could obviously lead to complex workflows. You could have to compromise quite dramatically on your ideal workflow if you're working with 10 other friends. But it could also mean that you don't actually get on and do anything. But I think on balance, I think there's still a really good thing if you're just really aware of the things that could trip you up. And one of the comments I got actually when I spoke about this somewhere else is that, look, if you've already got this sort of working group of people for other things, that's when it works really well, when you're already organised into a working collaborative group of people. And I think that's a really good point. So I wanted to also see where you thought at this point you were, because we've got a zany title for this afternoon, of course, and there's a point to it. Where do we think we are? Are we sort of dragging ourselves, kicking and screaming like zombies to this thing called preservation and data archiving? Or are we unicorns, either in the Silicon Valley sense or in the kind of springing off into the sky sense? Who knows? I don't know, I'm probably a little bit closer to the unicorn, I hope, if I know a little bit about it. Have a think about, where you are as individuals. Importantly, where your organisation is. Do they understand me? Do they understand my problem? How do I evangelise internally about this stuff? I won't ask you to tell me. I'm a zombie. But that was really what we were thinking of is when we were talking about that from that point of view. So thank you very much. Thank you for that.